Chapter 10, Gender and Age. Just like race, ethnicity, social class, even age are stratified, so is gender. Gender stratification is when males and females have unequal access to property, power, and prestige. Now, gender is significant because it is a master status. It cuts across all aspects of our social life. No matter what we attain or achieve in our lifetime, we carry the label male and female with us. This label guides or directs our behavior and serves as a basis for power and privilege. Sex and gender reflect different bases. Sex, for example, is the biological characteristics that distinguish males and females, including primary sex organs, the organs related to reproduction, and secondary sex organs, the physical distinctions not related to reproduction, like males with broad frames, deeper voices, and more body hair, females with higher voices, less body hair, and broader hips. So these things typically develop during the time of adolescence or puberty. Now, gender, on the other hand, is a social construction, which varies from one society to another and refers to what the group considers proper for its males and females. So to distinguish, sex equals male or female, and gender equals masculinity or femininity. We inherit our sex and we learn our gender. The social significance of gender is that it is the means by which society controls its members. It sorts us on the basis of sex into different life experiences. So here, this again, standards of gender. Each human group determines its ideas of what is male and what is female. So they determine ideas of maleness and femaleness. Standards of gender are arbitrary and vary from one culture to another. But due to ethnocentrism, each group thinks that its preferences reflect what gender really is. Around the world, men and women try to make themselves appealing by aspiring to that group's standards of gender. And so we see media reflections of this, and it's reinforced within our families, amongst our friends. So it's very significant. Okay, so now some researchers argue that biological factors, the two X chromosomes in females and the X and Y chromosomes in males, result in differences in conduct, with men being more aggressive and domineering and women being more comforting and nurturing. Now, if you examine this little activity, this gender remixer, it is an illustration of how when children at a young age are being marketed towards the toys that they purchase or that they want. It's very different in the way they're marketed. The boys' toys are very assertive, aggressive, and the girls' toys are very service-oriented and cooperative. And so you take a look at, there'll be a link in e-learning to access that mashup activity with boys and girls toys and even Legos. But again, we see, these, is the differences really biological or are they cultural? Now, the dominant position in sociology is that social factors explain why we do what we do. People in every society determine what the physical differences separating men and women mean to them. As children, we learn these contrasting or different explanations of life and then take the positions that society assigns to us on the basis of our sex. Sociologists argue that if biology was the primary factor in human behavior, then women and men all over the world would all behave the same way. The fact is that gender varies greatly from culture to culture. More and more sociologists, though, are acknowledging that biological factors are involved in human behavior. In the nature versus nurture debate, almost all sociologists take the side of nurture. In recent years, however, we are cautiously opening the door to biology. Real-life cases provide us with support for the argument that men's and women's behavior is influenced by biology. First, for example, we have a medical accident in the case of Brenda David. In 1963, during a routine circumcision of identical twin boys, an accident occurred, leaving the parents with the decision to give their son a sex change operation and raise him as a girl. Brenda received female hormones. They treated him as a girl. They dressed him as a girl. The child, started out well, behaving as a girl. But by adolescence, Brenda became very unhappy and had a difficult time adjusting to being female. She had conflicting feelings that resulted in her father explaining the accident to her. This is the story of David Reimer, if anyone wants to kind of explore this further. Brenda then began the process of transition to David. He married a woman and adopted her children, but he could not escape his turmoil. And again, it affected his entire family. And there is, again, more information about his case. He ultimately ended his life tragically, committing suicide. There are also studies, there have been many studies of testosterone levels in Vietnam veterans. They found that boys with higher levels tended to be more aggressive. And in 1985, the U.S. government began a health study of Vietnam veterans. They found that the men who had higher levels of testosterone tended to be more aggressive and to have more problems. Yet, when controlling for social class, it revealed that social factors like socialization, subculture, life goals, and self-definitions were significant in these men's behaviors. A former ASA, American Sociological Association president, Alice Rossi, a feminist sociologist, also suggested that women are better prepared biologically for mothering than are men. And she states that nature provides biological predispositions that are overlaid with culture, so that it is not either biology or the environment. As sociologists, we need to uncover how social factors modify biology to determine how different gets translated into unequal. Now, sociologists acknowledge biological factors. We acknowledge that they are involved in some human behavior other than reproduction and childbearing, but how that can get translated into, different is unequal. Different is not less. Now, traditional models of gender expect males to be strong, competitive, shield their emotion and not show weakness. Their masculinity is defined by not being feminine. Females, on the other hand, are expected to show emotion, express greater compassion, and feel and show fears and weaknesses. We do this by doing gender. Doing gender is a concept that was developed by Candace West and Don H. Zimmerman in 1987. Doing gender means that gender is a routine accomplishment in everyday life. We do gender every day. We do gender in our interactions. It is a product of our social interactions. Not what a person is, it is what a person does. If we deviate from the normative gender roles or gender scripts, we will be harshly criticized. So for a young boy who cries when they lose their, Little League baseball game, that little boy is criticized to not cry and hold in their feelings. That's an example of where we reinforce the doing of gender. Different messages with different meanings are given to boys and girls. The clothes we wear, the things we do, the way we carry our money. If you think about how, many women carry their belongings in a purse or a handbag. Do men carry those? How do men carry those things? How many guys carry a purse? How we walk, how we talk. All these things we are doing gender. When men and women work at jobs that are not, the traditional gender role that they, normally work out, we say we're reclaiming gender by doing traditional feminine and masculine activities at home. So, for example, for a woman who is, out working, on a construction site, when she comes home, she may, reinforce her feminine side by, putting makeup on and dressing very feminine to reclaim that gender role. That's an example of that. New models of gender include a softer masculinity among males and stronger dominance among females. We also talk of the idea of multiple masculinities, where strong dominant men are embracing a feminine side, becoming more nurturing, and also showing and expressing emotion, developing bromances, and getting, their nails done, and carrying man purses. With these new models of gender, we are witnessing a decrease in homophobia. And homophobia is a dislike and fear of homosexuality. Homophobia requires a need to maintain strict gender boundaries. But as our attitudes shift, there's no longer a need to maintain these strict boundaries. When it comes to gender inequality in global perspective, gender is the primary division between people around the world. Since every society sorts men and women into separate groups and gives them different access to property, power, and prestige, we see these divisions as always favoring men as a group. Because society sets up barriers to deny women equal access, they are referred to as a minority, even though they outnumber men. Remember, a minority group, they are discriminated, means that they are discriminated against because of physical or cultural characteristics, regardless of their numbers. So how did females become a minority group? After reviewing the historical record, historian and feminist Gerda Lerner has concluded that women as a group have never held decision-making power over men as a group. This was true even in the earliest known societies, in which there was much less gender discrimination, like at the time of the hunting and gathering and horticultural societies. In patriarchal societies like these, in which men dominate women and authority is vested in males, the theory behind points to the social consequences of human reproduction. Since life expectancy was short and women were tied to reproductive roles like nursing and birthing children, the bearing and caretaking of children, women assumed these tasks around the home since they were so closely connected. Little prestige was given to these tasks. This is the sex typing of work. Men, on the other hand, took over hunting of large animals, and they left home for extended periods of time. This enabled men to make contact with other tribes, to trade with those other groups, wage war, and basically gain prestige by returning home with prisoners of war or with large animals to feed the tribe. An anthropologist by the name of George Murdoch surveyed 324 pre-modern societies and found activities to be sex-typed in all of them. Activities considered female in one society may be male in another. There was nothing about anatomy that required any of this. Universally, greater prestige is given to male activities regardless of what they are. If caring for cattle is men's work, it carries high prestige. If it is women's work, it has less prestige. Other areas of global discrimination occur in the areas of education, politics, paid employment, and violence against women. Global violence against women is a serious human rights issue. Historically, women were subjected to foot binding in China, for example, witch burning in Europe. Today, we have wife beating, female infanticide, and rape. There's female prostitution and even female circumcision. Honor killings are also a form of violence against women in the global world. A woman who is thought to have disgraced her family in, say, in India, in Jordan, in Kurdistan, in Pakistan, is killed by a male relative, usually a brother or her husband or uncle or father. Because there is a value placed on virginity, if a woman is raped, has sex outside of marriage, she would be viewed as disgracing the family and would be subject to honor killing. Next, we'll discuss gender inequality in the U.S. Gender inequality is not accidental. A society's culture and institutions both justify and maintain its customary forms of gender inequality. So as we discuss gender inequality and gender as a structured feature of society, let's first look at how change in this area of social life came about in the U.S. In the early history of the United States, women maintained a second-class status that was taken for granted. Wives legally belonged to their husbands, and until the 20th century, U.S. women did not have the right to vote, hold property, make legal contracts, or serve on a jury. The feminist philosophy was a response to this patriarchy. Feminism is the belief that men and women should be politically, economically, and socially equal, and that gender stratification must be met with organized resistance. Feminists further believe that biology is not destiny and that stratification by gender is wrong. Now, males did not willingly give up their privileges to women. Rather, greater political rights for women resulted from a prolonged and bitter struggle waged by the first wave of feminism. And the National Women's Party was founded in 1916. These feminists were known as suffragists. Prior to this, in the summer of 1848, Seneca Falls, groundwork was laid for the suffrage movement. Women were being excluded from abolitionist organizations, so the following women became well-known leaders: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Lucy Stone. Alice Paul introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, to Congress. She and others were sent to prison and treated badly, to say the least. Some of them went on hunger strikes and were force-fed during their time in prison. This movement was divided into radical and conservative branches. The radical branch wanted to reform all social institutions. The conservative branch concentrated only on winning the vote for women, and this branch dominated. After winning the right to vote in 1920, the movement dissolved. Now, the second wave of feminism began in the 1960s, and it continues today. As more women gained an education and began to work outside the home, they compared their wages and working conditions to those of men. As awareness of gender inequalities grew, protest and struggle emerged. The goals of the second wave of feminism are broad, ranging from changing work roles and raising women's pay to changing policies on violence against women and legalizing abortion. After 1990, the third wave emerged, and this current wave has three main aspects, among others. The first is a greater focus on women in the least industrialized or developing countries, fighting to improve those conditions. Education, for example. The second is a criticism of the values that dominate work in society. Males' qualities like competition, toughness, independence, and callousness need to be replaced with more cooperative, connection, and interdependence and openness. The third is the removal of barriers to women's double standard, and so allowing women's more freedom of expression in terms of their sexuality. While women enjoy more rights today, gender inequality still continues to play a central role in social life. If we look at gender inequality in healthcare, first of all, there is a growing evidence of sexual discrimination in the healthcare system. Studies showed that women were twice as likely to die after coronary bypass surgery than men, and they could not be explained by women having smaller blood vessels than men. What they found was unintended discrimination. Physicians had not taken the complaints of chest pains as seriously in female patients as they had in males. As a result, women received surgery later, after this disease had a chance to progress, which ultimately reduced their chances for survival. Men were more likely to be sent for stress tests and heart scans. Surgeons were also likely to recommend more radical surgeries to their female patients on their reproductive systems than were actually necessary. Hysterectomies have become so common that by age 60, 1 out of 3 U.S. women has had her uterus surgically removed. Other evidence is in the increase in the number of C-sections that were not medically necessary. Gender inequality is also evident in education. In the past, women were not allowed to attend college with men until 1832. Ohio's Oberlin College was the first to admit women, and they had to, at the time, wash the male students' clothing, they had to clean their rooms, and actually serve them meals. Then we started to see a change. By 1900, 1/3 of college students were women. So evidence suggests that women have made definite education gains, and we could see that in this table. If we see the orange bar represents the men, and the purple bar here represents women. From 1900 to 1950, we see that large spike in 1950 where men, during the time of the GI Bill, there was an increase in male enrollment. But prior to that, the male enrollment was starting to decline. Then we saw the spike as a result of the GI Bill, and then again, male enrollment has continued to decline. At that same time, women's enrollment has continued to grow and surpass male college enrollment. More females than males are enrolled in U.S. colleges and universities, and these are some differences, again, if we look in the next table at racial ethnic differences. College students by sex and race and ethnicity. We see again the males represented by the orange bar and the women represented by the purple bar. And in each racial ethnic group, we see a larger number of women enrolled than males. African Americans have the most women relative to men, while Asian Americans have the least. Females earn 57% of all bachelor's degree, and they complete their bachelor degree requirements faster than men. The proportion of professional degrees earned by women has increased sharply. And here in this table, if we look at dentistry, law, and medicine, again, the men are represented by the orange bar, the women by the purple bar. And if you look within each profession, they're comparing 1970 to 2014 data. And you could see the stark difference in each of these professions where it used to be majority male, and now it's almost equal of males and females. Despite these gains, some old practices and patterns persist. For example, gender tracking. It is gender socialization and not biology that channels men and women into different educational paths. In college, males and females are channeled into different fields. 81% of engineering degrees are awarded to males, while 88% of library science degrees are awarded to women. So men are more likely to be enrolled in STEM programs, the science, technology, engineering, and math programs, and females are more likely to be enrolled in liberal arts and sciences. In graduate school, the proportion of females enrolled in programs decreases with each year of education. There's also gender stratification in both the rank and pay in higher education institutions. Women professors are less likely to be in higher ranks of academia, less likely to be taken seriously, and are paid less than their male counterparts. And finally, women's sports are still underfunded and are not considered as important as men's sports. If we look at this slide here, Title IX addresses this issue in that it states, no person in the U.S. shall be on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. If sports are not afforded to the degree of interest and participation in that sport, college funding is affected. And here we have a YouTube video that I will have the link. If you cannot click on this link, it will be posted in eLearning. Now let's take a look at gender inequality in the workplace. One of the chief characteristics of the U.S. workforce is the steady growth in the number of women who work outside the home for wages. Today, nearly 1 in every 2 women is employed. So we're going to take a look at the pay gap, the glass ceiling, and sexual harassment. This table illustrates the proportion of men and women in the U.S. labor force from 1890 and what's projected to be into the future, where the line has actually converged. Now you'll see a dip in the male proportion in the workplace in the between 1940 and 1950, and a spike in the number of women who work. That, of course, illustrates the war. At wartime, men went off to war, and then the women, the Rosie of the Riveter, that's the illustration there. But after that, after the war, we start to see more and more women. There was a plateau for women in the 1950s and 60s. And then, after the 1960s, women started to become more actively involved in the workplace, and men it started to converge. Geographically speaking, where a woman lives makes a difference in how likely she will work outside the home. The differences here may reflect regional, subcultural difference, which still needs to be researched. So, for example, the fewest women in the workforce live in West Virginia, Mississippi, and New Mexico, while the most women in the workplace live in North Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska. And there's probably some states that are tied. But you look at the green states where it's more than average, or New Jersey, if you take a look at New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that's average, and then the purple states are less than average. Okay, now the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap begins with the first job after graduation. On average, employers start men at higher salaries than women, and women never seem to be able to catch up. Men earn more than women, even when their educational achievement is the same. So that's what this table represents. These are the average or mean earnings of full-time year-round workers. So if you look at, the orange bar represents men, the purple bar represents women. And in every educational category, the men earn more than women. The pay gap is so great in the U.S. that women who work full-time average only 72% of what men are paid. And we see that here, this pay gap, where women only make 72% of what men earn. And this is not unique to the United States. All industrialized nations have a greater gap in pay. Now, some of the reasons for this gender pay gap. Researchers found that half of the gender pay gap is due to women choosing lower paying careers. The other half is due to gender discrimination and the child penalty. Women miss out on work experiences when they're out on maternity leave or engaging in tasks that are related to a child. Opportunities while they care for their children may be missed when during the time of work. There's also a CEO gap. And if you look at the top 500 corporations, the Fortune 500, only 18 of those companies are headed by women. It increased from 7 in 2003. So there has been strides, but again, it's not equal. The author also examined the names of the CEOs of the 350 of the largest corporations, and he found John, Robert, James, William, Charles most frequently. So few women and few ethnic names at the top. Okay, now before I talk about this topic here, sexual harassment, I want to mention the glass ceiling. Is the glass ceiling cracking? The glass ceiling is the invisible barrier that women, minorities, face in trying to reach their full potential in executive positions. Researchers find that women are not in positions such as marketing, sales, and production, jobs that bring in profits and produce top executives. Instead, women are directed toward the service industry, human resources, public relations, for example, usually in a not-for-profit as well. The glass ceiling is also so strong because women typically lack mentors, individuals who take an interest in them and show them the ropes. Mentors provide networks and opportunities, without which many doors remain closed. There are definitely cracks in this glass ceiling as women learn to play by men's rules and develop a style with which men feel comfortable. It helps that in the background of about 3/4 of these women is a supportive husband and partner who shares household duties and adapts his career to the needs of the executive wife. Now, if we take a look at how men fare when they go into occupations that have been predominantly held by females, we find quite a different experience for them. In 1992, Christina L. Williams conducted research on men when they entered occupations such as nursing and teaching, librarianship, and social work. And she found that men actually experience what is called, or what is referred to as, a glass escalator, or they're fast-tracked into administrative and management positions. In other words, they move up more quickly than female coworkers do. Now, this concept of sexual harassment, and worse. It wasn't until the 1970s that women began to make a connection between unwanted sexual advances on the job and their subordinate positions. As women began to discuss the problem, they named it sexual harassment and came to see such unwanted sexual advances by men in powerful positions as a structural problem. With this new perception, women no longer view these sexual advances as sexual attraction, but as the misuse of authority and power. Men can also fall victim to this type of harassment, but because men are the ones who we find in the majority of positions of authority, they're typically the harassers. The meaning of sexual harassment is vague, and court cases are usually the basis for determining what is and is not sexual harassment. It is actually an abuse of power that is structured into relationships of inequality in the workplace. We also find gender inequality as a characteristic of violence in the U.S. and around the world. Most victims of violence are females. Each year, 1 of every 1,000 U.S. girls aged 12 to 50 is the victim of a rape. Most victims know their attackers. Only 1 of 3 rapes is committed by a stranger, yet we fear these the most. Date rape or acquaintance rape is the sexual assault where the assailant is acquainted with the victim. This is much more common than most of us think. Most cases go unreported because the victim feels partially responsible. She knows the person and she was with him voluntarily. And here we see the age in this table, the age breakout, the age of the victim and the rate per 1,000 females. And here we see the relationship, as I just mentioned. In the majority of cases, the victim knew the rapist. When it comes to murder, males are more likely than females to commit murder and be the victim of murder, as this table illustrates. Other forms of violence against women include battering, spousal abuse, incest, female circumcision, and honor killing. Although women are less likely than men to kill, when they do, judges are more likely to be lenient on them. Still, very rare women are found on death row. It's a much smaller number compared to men. There have been female executions, but far fewer than male. Feminists use symbolic interactionism to understand violence against women. They stress that U.S. culture promotes violence by males. It teaches men to associate power, dominance, strength, virility, and superiority with masculinity. They argue Interactionists argue that men use violence to try to maintain a higher status. To solve this, we must break this link between violence and masculinity. Despite the gains that U.S. women have made in recent elections, they continue to be underrepresented in political office, especially in higher office. Reasons for this include the fact that women have been underrepresented in law and business, careers from which politicians are drawn from. Women have not necessarily seen themselves as a voting bloc who need political action to overcome discrimination. Women have generally found the roles of mother and politician to be incompatible. And men have rarely incorporated women into the centers of decision making or presented them as viable candidates. There are signs that the pattern is changing. More women are going into law and business. Childcare is now more likely to be seen as a mutual responsibility. And party leaders are searching for qualified candidates who can win regardless of gender. And here we see a table of the changing face of politics. And the office, whether it be national or state, we see the office is held by women, the percentage, and then the office is held by women, the actual number. For example, Nancy Pelosi was the first woman elected by her colleagues as a minority leader of the House of Representatives. In 2007, she became the first female Speaker of the House. In 2008, Hillary Clinton came very close to being the Democratic Party nominee, losing to President Obama. She won more primaries than any other woman in history, became the Secretary of State and the Senator of New York. She did very well in the race. She was up against Donald Trump, and she won the popular vote there. In 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor was the nation's first female Supreme Court justice. Geraldine Ferraro was the first presidential candidate running with president candidate Democrat Walter Mondale in 1984. Sarah Palin was on the Republican ticket for the vice president in the 2008 election, running with John McCain. The highest ranking woman in the cabinet was Madeleine Albright, the first female U.S. Secretary of State appointed by Bill Clinton in 1996. Condoleezza Rice, appointed Secretary of State in the Bush administration in 2005. And from what I'm hearing, as Vice President Biden, who is now running for president, has been talking about having a female vice presidential candidate run with him. So if we look at the future, it looks hopeful. As women play a fuller role in decision-making processes, further structural obstacles to women's participation in society will give way. As gender stereotypes are broken down, both males and females will be free to feel and express their needs and emotions. Sociologists believe there is no reason for biological differences to be translated into social inequalities. Now we will discuss aging in global perspective. Every society must deal with the problem of people growing old, because more of the world's population is considered elderly than ever before. Age is not a qualifying measurement of old. A society's definition and treatment of its elderly is socially constructed. That is, attitudes about the elderly are rooted in culture and vary from one social group to another. Some examples of how the way the elderly are treated. If we look at the indigenous culture of the Tiwi in Australia, they basically engage in a process called covering up, where they get rid of their old. They consider the old decrepit, and especially the females who tend to live longer, basically dig a hole and put them in it. So they're not, really concerned with how the elderly fare in later life. As opposed to the Abkhazians, who are south of Russia and northwest of Georgia, a country in Europe, they pay respect to the elderly, and these elderly tend to live longer. So when a country industrializes, its people do tend to live longer. Technological advances mean safer work, better food, better living conditions, cleaner water, and advances in medicine. With more people reaching these older ages, we call this the graying of America. And here we see a map of the world, and we can see where the highest ranking countries are. The lowest percentage of population age 65 and older is in Uganda, South Sudan, and Zambia. The highest percentage of population age 65 and older is in Japan, Germany, and Italy. And this table illustrates the from 1900 to 2040, the year of birth. This data from the historical statistics of the U.S. And the statistical abstract of the U.S., looking at life expectancies by year. The orange bar is men, and the purple bar being women. And pretty much, and it's projected to go into 2040. Women tend to live longer than men. So the largest number of elderly in the U.S. are white women outliving white men. We could see this varies, by race and ethnicity. This is the projection, and this population is projected to continue to grow. People are definitely living longer. And this shows the bar graph illustrating the increase in the percentage of the aged over time in the U.S. Aged was only 4% in 1900. It's now up to 22%, projected in 2050. And these are the median ages of the U.S. population. As you could see, the population is getting older. The median age, that means half of the people are above that age and half of the people, the population, are below it. In 1850, that median age was 20. Now it's projected to go up to 42. So people are definitely living longer. And here are the countries, the various countries. The top portion of these bars, the life expectancy, if you look at Italy, Japan, the world's longest life expectancies of 79 and older, and then the world's shortest life expectancies is the bottom half of these bar graphs, below 60. It's been said that there are going to be more states around the United States that look like Florida. So as Florida goes, so does the nation. There's a large elderly population living in Florida. So the least elderly live in Alaska, Utah, and Texas. The most elderly live in Florida, Maine, and West Virginia. And we're going to start to see more states that resemble the demographics of Florida. So in the coming years, sociologists need to examine cultural attitudes about aging, types of family relationships, work histories, and health practices. So again, all of these variables we want to consider: race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, and so forth. So let's take the symbolic interactionist perspective. Factors or labels that people associate with aging: biology, a personal history, gender, age, and timetables. First, biology. When are you considered old? If we look at biology, it's how a person looks and feels. And we may start to feel old as our eyesight and our hearing start to diminish, or wrinkles start to develop. Start to get aches and pains, arthritis, and men may start to go bald. Both men and women may start to, their hair starts to turn gray. So that would be the biological indicators that people look at, and we start to consider who is old. The second factor in is personal history. You want to think of things that affect your self-image, an illness or an injury that limits our mobility. Becoming a grandparent or, at an early age may also indicate person feeling old. The third factor is gender age. The relative value that cultural places on men's and women's ages. So for example, men often, look distinguished at an older age, while women may tend not to, and may tend to look haggard and so forth. So that's why there's a lot of beauty products out there on the market to help women not age. The last is the timetables. When a society defines a person as old, it's not a fixed number. And so, generally, we see that age as, somewhere around the time of retirement. Aging is relative, which means it varies from culture to culture. So when a person, tends to reach that criteria that is considered old in a particular culture will vary. Robert Butler coined the term ageism to refer to the prejudice, discrimination, and hostility directed to people because of their age. With this comes a perception of old age. A perception that the older we get, the more useless and the foolish we are, and more of a liability we become. Gerontology is the study of the social, psychological, cognitive, and biological aspects of aging, and it looks at particular problems of aging. So we want to tend to kind of look at the various aspects, and gerontologists tend to study the aging process. Perceptions are definitely changing with increasing wealth of the elderly and the baby boom generation. There's a more positive perception that they're useful, that they have wisdom, and that they are an asset. The mass media will help communicate this if they continue to communicate aging in a more positive message that they can give most people about the aging process. As long as the mass media, focuses on the negative, then we'll see a negative impression. But if they focus on the positive aspect of aging, staying active and youthful, and that we might get a better, more positive perception of aging. Within the functionalist perspective, we have these three theories: disengagement theory, activity theory, and continuity theory. In order to maintain stability, remember, functionalists are all about social stability. This perspective has these three theories. So the first, disengagement theory, is that mutual severing of societal roles. Elaine Cumming and William Henry developed this theory, and they said that the elderly disengage, basically retire from their positions for younger people to take over, where it would be mutually beneficial. Now, this theory is often criticized because it's not always mutual. The elderly may still want to stay active and be engaged in their work and in the community, and so it may not always be mutually severing. Activity theory finds that older people who maintain a high level of activity tend to be more satisfied with life than those who do not. And then we have continuity theory, which focuses on how people adjust to retirement by continuing aspects of their earlier lives, using strategies and resources to cope with aging. Higher social classes may actually be better able to do this, but some examples of this might be, a retired school teacher who might volunteer to tutor students at the library, say, for example. Now, critics claim this is too broad and not specific to the elderly, this continuity theory. I just posed the definition here for age cohorts, that we see that people who are born at roughly the same time and who pass through the life course together. So age cohorts is something we would want to think about when we're discussing the elderly population. Last is a conflict perspective, and the conflict perspective examines social life as a struggle between groups for scarce resources. Social Security, for example, was enacted by Congress in the 1920s and 1930s when people over age 65 had no savings and they could not support themselves. In 1965, Congress eliminated mandatory retirement at age 65. It was mostly voluntary. One generation makes demand on another generation for these scarce resources. So as the number of elderly grow, there are less workers to support them. So that's basically Social Security is not a savings account. It's something that workers today pay into for the senior citizens of the day. There are organizations in place today to protect the gains of the elderly. The Gray Panthers, for example, in 1960, they encouraged people of all ages to work for the welfare of both the elderly and the young. The AARP, which stands for the American Association of Retired Persons, there are 35 million members. They monitor federal and state legislation. They mobilize its members to act on issues that affect their welfare. And they really start recruiting people when they turn 50 to join the organization. So here we see a look at Social Security payments to beneficiaries. So the line graph illustrates the dramatic increase in the amount of money spent on Social Security. And here are healthcare costs for the elderly and the disabled. The line graph illustrates the dramatic increase in the amount of money spent on both Medicare and Medicaid. Now, a Medicare is intended for the elderly and disabled, while Medicaid is intended for the poor. Here we see the age and trends in poverty. For example, at one point, the elderly were significantly more in poverty, living in poverty than children, and we've seen these lines kind of crisscross after around the early to mid 70s. Definitely by 1980s, where we see more children under 18 in poverty than the elderly, 65 and older, where those lines actually crisscrossed. So if we look to the future, we really need to adjust and to determine the best way to deal with the increasing aging population, because it's definitely something that is presenting. People are definitely living longer, and so the aging population is something we need to consider. And we're also think of ourselves, at some point we will be in that cohort, that population that's elderly. So today we know that they're in much better health, they're living longer, and so it's stretching out that lifespan. So we need to be, creative in our thoughts about the aging population. So it leaves us the question, how will the elderly contribute to society? How will society support them? How will the life course be redefined to take into consideration this expansion of life? And what will this mean for the elderly? We want to definitely consider also the impact of technology, which is helping to stretch that lifespan. More technology, more medical technology is helping us live longer. And how will younger workers be able to support retired people for 100 years or longer? Definitely questions needing to be considered. So I added these at the end to kind of give you some new texting codes to add to your repertoire of text messages. So I'm going to peruse some of these senior citizen texting codes. These are supposed to be some funny sociology here. And here we have two YouTube videos of the happy husbands and seniors that are definitely attempting to use technology today. And I'm sure under the circumstances of the coronavirus, where we're all staying at home, many seniors are tapping into these kinds of resources to help stay connected with family members and friends.